Vera Cox grabbed her favorite blue water bottle and slid on her running shoes. She double-checked to see she had everything and stepped into the cool air. As she rifled through her keyring for the right one, a cold gust sent a shiver through her. After locking up the house, she gave a deep breath and started jogging into the cold, dark night. It was only a few steps before she felt like something was missing and turned around to find her phone had slipped out. She grabbed it and continued her run, cursing herself for wearing the shorts with the hole in the pocket. As Vera jogged down the dark, empty street, she looked up at the cloudless sky. Her headphones were broken, so she just listened to the sounds around her. Cicadas sang their otherworldly song above her head, and somewhere in the distance a dog howled into the night. And then there were her footsteps. They echoed up into the sky as if they were in stereo. They reverberated all around her, making her head spin. But there was something off about them. Each step rang out twice in her ears. Vera listened to it for a few moments and shivered. That wasn't right. She had run this same path for months and had never heard an echo. She cocked her head and began listening harder. No, there was a second pair of footsteps behind her. Someone must have been out on that road with her. Their steps were so synced up she almost hadn't noticed. But then again, what if that was exactly what they wanted? They had to belong to a man, judging by how heavy they sounded. Vera's heart began to beat a little faster in her chest. There was a man behind her, and he didn't want her to know he was there. Suddenly, she felt silly. She had a history of overreacting. She'd once called the cops on a stalker, only for it to be a very persistent Jehovah's Witness. The person behind her was probably just some runner who'd happened to be on the same path as her. Their footsteps lining up was just a coincidence. And then she had a stupid thought. Pretending not to notice the man behind her, she slowed down her pace to see what would happen. She knew the person wouldn't do anything, but she decided to try it anyway, just to put her mind at ease. Without missing a beat, the person behind her slowed down too, masking his footsteps with hers perfectly. A cold sweat broke out on the back of her neck and she sped up. To her horror, the man behind her did too. Was he trying to sneak up on her? Vera reached for her phone in her pocket, but instead all she found was the hole. She blinked back, tears in her eyes, realizing her only lifeline was probably lying on some sidewalk behind her. She cursed herself for not carrying a pocket knife on her. If the man did try to grab her, what could she do to defend herself? Most of the houses in this part of town were abandoned, and even if she did find a house with people in it, would they open the door before she had a chance to get in? Vera's eyes drifted down to a large rock sitting on the side of the road. She bent down and scooped it up mid-stride. Well, it wasn't ideal, but it was better than nothing. For another moment she considered the possibility that this was all just her overreacting. There was probably a perfectly reasonable explanation for all of this. She threw a quick glance behind her to settle her nerves. The figure advancing on her was shrouded in darkness. There was no light on his head, making him seem almost faceless. He did nothing to put her mind at ease, but still, she saw nothing that screamed danger about him. She almost dropped the rock in her hands and forgot about him. She almost moved on to pretend like nothing had ever happened. Almost. In the dim light, Vera just barely made out the glint of a knife in his hand. Vera's heart skipped a beat and she struggled to control her breathing. Things like this only happened on the news or in bad dreams. To her horror, the echo was getting louder now. Her pursuer was closing the distance between them quickly. She grasped the rock tighter, sweat trickling down her forehead. Her hunter was now just a few paces behind her. The man's footsteps got louder and louder until she heard them thundering right behind her. He was so close. She heard his ragged breathing just inches away. She took a deep breath and started counting down from 3. However, she was interrupted by a hand roughly grabbing her shoulder. She turned around to face the tall, dark figure closing in on her and blindly swung the rock in front of her. She missed, and the man went to grab her arm. She began attacking blindly with the rock, but he slipped past each one. She gave one last swing, and the rock finally connected with his jaw, splattering blood and teeth everywhere. Her pursuer released his grasp and clutched his broken jaw, now hanging loosely open. He took another step toward her, the knife glinting in his hand. She brought the rock down on his head, and he collapsed on the ground in a heap, knife still clenched in his fist. Vera stood over the man, panting and gasping, the rock dripping in her hands. A dark liquid dripped from his mouth and the wound on his head. In the darkness, she could barely see it, but she knew what it was. Legs shaking, she took a step forward into the darkness to get a better look at the man. He wore a tank top and jogging shorts. He weakly lifted his arm, holding what she thought was a knife. In the moonlight, she realized it was a phone. Her phone. He opened his mouth and weakly managed to say, You dropped it, before collapsing on his back. Tears began clouding Vera's eyes as it dawned on her. Her face stretched into a mask of horror, and she knelt down at the man's side. She leaned in to give him mouth-to-mouth before realizing his head had been partially caved in. His broken jaw hung open loosely like a puppet, and teeth were scattered all around him. She pressed her fingers to his wrist, but found no pulse. She looked around frantically for the phone, crawling over to it in the dirt. She snatched it up and tried to press the buttons for 911 with shaking fingers, but they were too slick with blood. As she fumbled with the controls, she noticed something strange. The blood covering her hands wasn't red. It was sticky like blood, but instead of red, it was jet black. Instead of the metallic smell of blood, it smelled like tar or motor oil. And that's when she heard it. It was a single, wet squish sound. She sat there listening for a moment before she heard another one. It was coming from the jogger behind her. She turned around to look at the man lying on the road and bathed in shadow. Despite having no pulse a few moments ago, he'd sat up and was facing her, broken jaw hanging agape. Vera tried to study his face for a clue about what had happened, but his face was obscured in darkness. His shadowy hand picked something small up from his side and brought it to his mouth. Another sickening squelch rang out. He picked up another, and as she squinted at it in the darkness, she realized it was a tooth. Her stomach lurched. He was mashing the teeth back into his mouth, one by one. She just watched him, unable to process what she was seeing. After he'd mashed the last tooth back in place, he stared at her. His broken jaw dripped more of that same black liquid from before. She watched on as the shadowy figure slowly lifted his hands to his mouth, and with a nauseating crack, snapped his jaw back in place. Vera wanted to run, but she felt rooted in place, only able to watch on in horror. Then the figure leaned into the moonlight, illuminating his face for the first time. His mouth was stretched into a wide, crooked grin as if to show off his new teeth. That same black blood dripped from his mouth and down his chin. Vera yelped and began to crawl backward, eyes wide. Then, to her horror, it began pulling itself to its feet, bulging eyes fixed on her as it did. That broke the spell for Vera. She stumbled to her feet and ran back down the dark road, legs shaking. Heavy footsteps thundered behind her, but she just looked straight ahead. She stumbled and staggered as she ran, not being able to see through the tears that were streaming down her face. The creature wheezed and sputtered as it ran, footsteps echoing behind her. As the houses and trees rushed by, she slowly began to realize that she was hopelessly lost. Her neighborhood was suddenly unfamiliar to her, and she'd been turning corners at random, not caring where they led. She was pushing her legs to the breaking point, but every time she slowed for even a second, she was sure she felt the man's dirty fingers grabbing at her hair. Just when she thought her legs were going to give out, she saw her house. Vera cried tears of relief and slammed into the door, pulling her keys from her pocket. She rifled through them to find the right one. She chanced to glance behind her, and as she did, the man came flying around the corner on all fours, black blood dripping from its smiling face. Her heart skipped a beat, and she whipped around, searching through her keyring. She seized the right one, and with shaky fingers jammed it into the keyhole. She heard gravel fly up as the creature reached her driveway. She threw open the door, flew inside, and slammed the door shut. The door made a loud thud sound as the creature threw itself at it. She had a horrible thought and froze. Was it strong enough to break through the door? She sat there waiting for the next crash, but it never came. Instead, she heard footsteps slowly shuffle away. Over time, they faded away until they were nothing but a memory. Vera stood there for a long time, waiting for it to come back. She looked out each window in the house, but she was only met with darkness. She gave a nervous laugh when she looked down at her hand. While running for her life down the road, she'd had her water bottle clenched in her hands the whole time. Vera tossed it aside and collapsed onto her couch, still shaking with fear. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, paced her home, waiting for that thing to come back. Every time she'd consider sleeping, she'd spot a glimpse of a black eye peeking at her from the window, or hear the thud of a footstep just beyond the door. However, the morning sun renewed her confidence. She began coming up with reasonable explanations. It took time, but eventually she was able to convince herself that the whole ordeal couldn't have happened. It was just an anxiety attack brought on by stress or a sleepwalking episode. She didn't have so much as a scratch on her to prove it had happened. She would have been able to move on with her life, believing it had never happened. But it was much harder lying to herself while looking at her favorite blue water bottle, now stained jet black with tar. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. It really means a lot to me and to the author of the story, of course. Well, if you want to know more about me, I'm pretty much everywhere on social media. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can download my music on SoundCloud. I've got a Patreon if you feel like. Throw me $1 or $2. Very much appreciated. And of course, on Reddit, I have a place where you can leave stories if you want me to read one that you've written. Well, hoping to see you all again very soon. Till then, sweet dreams. Bye-bye.